Welcome to another episode of Code for Thought. For this episode, we go to the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, or the V&A as it is affectionately known, to meet with Kati Price, who heads the digital media and publishing team. The V&A is the museum for design and art and covers 5,000 years of human history and holds well over 1 million of objects. So what has a museum to do with software development, you might wonder? Well, actually, quite a lot. Firstly, the V&A was one of the first museums to go online in the 1990s. Since then, the digital estate, as Kati calls it, has steadily grown. And it caters for both the occasional visitor, the hobby designer, as well as the researcher and scientist. The V&A collection is truly vast and growing, and Kati takes us through how they approach designing a digital service for this rich set of data and objects. Their approach is user-centered and trying to connect the objects with a story about and around them. Starting with the user story is an interesting approach because often, as engineers, we start tackling the technical aspects first. So I believe this approach is a lesson we can all learn from. But apart from that, I hope you will check out the V&A online as well as visit the amazing site or sites in person if you can. And here now my conversation with Kati Price. Hello, Kati. Welcome to the show. It's a pleasure having you here. You're working at the Victoria and Albert Museum, but maybe you can do a little bit of an introduction yourself.
Thank you, Peter. And yes, it's great to be here. So thank you for inviting me. So I am Kati Price. I head up digital media and publishing at the V&A, and that's the world's leading museum of art and design. For those who are not familiar with it, we have a collection that spans about 5,000 years of human history and about 1.2 million objects and archives on top of that. We have a museum in South Kensington, but we've got a growing family of venues. We have a museum up in Dundee, but also some plans for the east of London with the opening of 2 new sites over there, including a collection centre, jointly termed V&A East, and also a new museum aimed at young people and creativity, which was formerly known as the Museum of Childhood, that's now going to be known as Young V&A. So we have an expanding portfolio of museums, and with that comes an expansion of our digital estate and digital offer, and that's what I look after.
Well, that's quite impressive. Actually, I didn't know that there are that many different branches of the Victoria and Albert Museum. I thought that, I obviously know because I live in London, the Victoria Albert Museum, the big centre in Kensington, but that's quite an impressive list of different venues.
It is, and we've always to a certain extent had a sort of multi-site offer, as we call it. We had the Museum of Childhood in Bethnal Green. Dundee's been open for a few years now, and South Kensington. But the exciting new addition to the family is V&A East, because it comprises a new museum, as I said, and a collection centre. And that's quite a new offer for the UK public, because we don't have open access collection centres. People might be familiar with the Boijmans that's just opened up in Rotterdam, which is probably the nearest comparable example of a big space full of lots of different types of objects that the public can interact with.
And I think your digital estate is also quite impressive, which is, of course, what we want to talk about today, because earlier this year, there was a number of articles about the digital platform of the Victoria and Albert Museum. Let's start with a high-level overview, what that actually is, what the estate is. Huge as it is, it probably will take a while to go through all of it, but maybe you can give us a helicopter view.
I think actually we were one of the first museums online back in the mid-90s. Forgive me, it was either 94 or 96, but I think it might have been 94. And it was actually sort of early days of people experimenting with what a digital presence might look like for a museum. And in those days, it was a website, but also a library catalogue. And actually, it was from a colleague of mine, Doug Dodds, who has recently left the museum, but who's an expert in computer art. And it was through his efforts that the V&A first got online. So since then, the estate's evolved from what we would call a sort of brochure website, just a list of opening times and what you can find inside. Even then, it had quite an expansive offer. It wasn't just a page with opening times. It also gave some overviews of the collections, etc. But obviously, since the 1990s, it has evolved considerably to include what we'd call a number of digital products and services, the sort of most notable of which is the collections online. We've recently revamped those. They were called Search the Collections and they operated as a separate website, but that's now been brought more closely together with the main part of the website. I can speak to that in more detail. That's now called Explore the Collections. So that's a place where you can find out all about the million plus objects in the collections. Then we have services like What's On, which again, with this expansion of the V&A family of sites, will then serve all the different the event portfolio, what we call the public program of the V&A. We've recently launched a large new online shop. So we sort of span across the digital estate the academic part of our offer, the story-led part of our offer, right to the sort of very functional, transactional aspects of the V&A to service all our sort of commercial ambitions. So when we're thinking about the digital estate, we're thinking about this sort of whole spectrum of servicing people for quite functional things and also taking them on journeys around the stories of our collections and making sure we configure that estate, even though underpinning it is lots of different systems and platforms, that it's all wrapped together as one beautiful seamless experience, because we are after all a design museum, so it's really important for us to package that up in a beautiful and intuitive and functional ways, really showing the website as an example of good design in and of itself, something that would be worthy of being in the V&A collections itself.
Yeah, maybe we can talk about this a little bit more. But early on in our conversation, you mentioned digital media and publishing. Could you sort of explain a little bit what the difference between the two is?
So my role covers both the digital part of our content offer, but also the editorial side of our publishing offer. So I have a management team of 4 looking after the digital product side, so across technology, design and product. And then on the content side, our head of content looks after digital content and publishing. So all the editorial offer of the V&A across digital things and all the wonderful books and catalogues, etc., that we produce. So we're trying to think about stories in the round. When we're commissioning stories, we think first of the story and the audience, and then we think about what elements of that story might end up in a book, for example, through an exhibition catalogue, and what might end up in other formats, for example, videos that people might find on YouTube. So we try and take a step back and start with the story and then think about what formats and channels and places that should exist, whether they're digital or their print.
Which is kind of a segue into the digital collection that I would like to home in a little bit more, because it is quite a story, of course. The collection, as you mentioned, is huge. It's 1.2 million or something like that, objects that you mentioned. So how do you go about designing such a huge task, and how do you go about it? And then maybe we can talk a little bit about the technical challenges that you faced.
Our starting point was trying to create this cohesive experience across the digital estate so that people see the same design language, they see the same brand experience across the digital estate. And we had this old website called Search the Collections, which at its time it did a very good job. It even won some awards. I think we were one of the first museums to have an API, a public API of our collections. So it did a great job. But that was back in the late noughties, and it had pretty much been left alone since then. And since then, people's tastes have changed, people's behaviours on the internet have changed. But we saw there was this real opportunity to not just have a separate website that shows all the collections data. And by the data, I mean both the image assets and all the metadata around our objects. Effectively, the giant database of all the objects in the museum put out on the internet, but thinking about how we could connect that collections data with the stories that we hold about those objects, because they were all housed in the main website and elsewhere. In fact, we like to call it the William Morris Challenge. So William Morris, the famous British designer and activist, he was talented in many areas, but he's well known, for example, for his textiles and wallpapers, for example. We even have a room designed by him in the V&A, in the cafe, if you should want to sit in a William Morris room. It's quite spectacular. And he's obviously an important figure in the history of the British design, art and design, but also in the history of the museum. And so he's one of our top keywords. People will always come to us for William Morris and finding out more about William Morris. But if you are interested in William Morris, the V&A actually holds data and information about William Morris and about 9 different systems. So we have things in the library catalogue, we have stuff in the archives, we have William Morris in our main website, lots of beautiful editorial content. We have all the collections data in what was known as Search the Collections. We even have William Morris in the shop. And there are a bunch of other systems too. So there was no one-stop shop where you could find out all that the V&A knows about William Morris. And so we thought we could start by at least bringing together the collections data with all the editorial content, because that's when we can start doing powerful things in terms of storytelling to take people from understanding about the objects themselves to zooming out a bit and understanding the bigger narratives around William Morris, around his practice, and how that relates more broadly to art and design in not just the Victorian period, but also before and after. We had this hunch that we should start bringing together the stories with the object data. And before we started designing anything or doing any engineering or any work on the content, we always take what we call a user-centered approach to developing digital products. So we always start with talking to our users, or people, as they're also known, the people that use our collections online. And so those people, what was interesting is that this initial survey that we did, we actually got 8,000 responses. We put the survey across the old collections website, across the main website, and some other places. We were really interested to find out who's accessing this information and why. Our hunch was that Search the Collections did a brilliant job for researchers who know exactly what to put into a search box, but possibly there were lots of other people who are interested in William Morris who might not know what objects he designed, might not know yet that they're interested in William Morris, but they're interested in the history of British design. And our offer didn't serve these sorts of people without a very specific, deep interest. But when we did this survey, we actually found out that actually most people were on our website looking for stories of our collections because of personal interest. And so didn't necessarily have all the tools and methodologies that somebody involved in more formal research might have. This hunch that people wanted us to bring together stories with data was a correct one. It was verified by our research. And we did another phase of research that really explored the different modes people are in. And so that really helped us inform a design approach, but also informed the sort of technical approach and also the content approach as well. We found 4 different modes from people who were indeed in research mode, but there are others in modes we labeled understand, explore, and discover. And sometimes there were competing needs across those different groups, but we ultimately used these modes to help inform the design process that resulted in what you now see as Explore the Collections, which is in beta and still being developed. At the moment, we're looking at this idea of contextual pages. We launched with the beta because we wanted to get this beta out quickly during lockdown last year, because we could see such a peak of interest in our collections online. And we thought it's a brilliant opportunity to serve this large, hungry online audience who really want to find out more about the stories of our collections. So for the first time, Explore the Collections brings together not just the data, but the editorial content we have about these objects. And it's gone down really well. We've got higher dwell times, we've got more traffic, we've got more use of some of the individual features around sort of how people use the taxonomy to explore horizontally, but also some really nice features like a you may also like feature, which is people probably are more familiar with on the likes of Amazon and sort of big retail sites. But actually we realize people love an image-led exploration across our collections. It's like a visual smorgasbord to take people through the collections on a journey. And that's worked really, really well because people have ended up being engrossed and looking at stuff they didn't know that they were interested in.
I think I find it quite interesting that you start with the user story or the use cases, shall we say, because very often in my experience in technical development, we start with the technical issues first. And I think it's quite a mindset change for a lot of technical teams to actually put the technical solution aside for a second and start with what is it we actually want to do. Did you have to struggle with that as well in your technical teams?
I would say the whole team across technology, product design and content all take a very user-centered approach. So our technology team isn't any different in that sense. That's the way we work. We're ultimately here to serve a large, diverse online audience as well as people in the building. And so we're always going to start with understanding what they need before we start speccing out any technology. That said, it was an old legacy infrastructure that we knew absolutely we needed to change. But to know what direction that was headed in, it was really essential to find out who was using our collections online. We also actually worked with people who weren't engaging with the collections online. I think it's really interesting to think about non-users as well as users and their needs, because that's ultimately how you can then expand that audience online. Our technology team were very involved in the user research and understanding what the implications were and what that might mean. So no, they're totally on board. I'm lucky.
So you mentioned a public API before, and what I would like to move on next to is maybe the more technical aspects, because when you have 9 different blobs that kind of need to work together, how do you actually go about designing the technical solution then ultimately, after you've done all your user research?
We knew that lots of people were already using our collections API, but it was old and it needed to be reconfigured. We actually were really interested in who the different types of people are that actually use collections APIs. And they are researchers. There are people using collections data for academic use. There are also people doing interesting, fun digital stuff. So, for example, there's a Chrome extension which can pop up a new collections object each day. There's a Twitter bot. The internet artist and thinker James Bridle did a brilliant project which paired today's headlines with relevant object from the V&A's collections. He
Really?
did that as part of an exhibition that we had at the V&A a few years ago. So there were people doing some really interesting creative things. It got us thinking about what the API could do for us, but also thinking about how we tap into larger online communities, in terms of helping their practice and helping get our collections out of a V&A silo. So, for example, a key driver for us in our work over the last few years, and particularly around the collections online, has been thinking about open source frameworks, and particularly for us, the International Image Interoperability Framework, also known as IIIF. And you can read a lot more about this on our blog from my colleagues on the technology side, who explain what the framework is and how we use it. But it's been a really brilliant way to have a consistent approach to how we display imagery on our site and make that imagery available by using this framework to other people across the internet to start telling stories that then bridge the gap between the V&A's collections and other international collections. So, for example, on our website, you will find some of Constable's work in our paintings collection. Whilst we have a large collection of constables, we don't have all the constables in the world. There are lots in other institutions, of course, not least in Yale Centre for British Art. And so we worked with Yale to use IIIF to start showing a story that then helps you understand how the preparatory sketches for John Constable's painting of Hadley Castle came into being. So the V&A holds the preparatory sketches, so you can see his pencil drawings, and you can see the final artworks at Yale Centre for British Art. But because we're both using IIIF, we can start creating features, in this case, like a tool that allows you to sort of toggle between the different states of that painting's evolution from preparatory sketch to finished oil painting. And that's such an exciting opportunity, I think, for us to start telling those stories that transcend all our institutional boundaries and tell bigger stories about artists and their creative practice. So that's the direction we're headed in. And in terms of technologies, we're interested in thinking about how we can package up our data in different ways to make it really accessible to a wide audience online, whether they are ordinary people who are just interested in stories of the world of art, design and performance, or whether they are researchers and academics, or whether there are people who like doing fun stuff on the internet to make new digital products and services and experiences.
I think listeners might be surprised to hear that you're actually using open source software. One could easily imagine that there's proprietary software that museums hold. But as you say, it's about telling a story, and that story sometimes crosses the boundaries of one specific site of a museum and even different museums. But going back to the API, is that API actually public? So if I were to develop my own V&A catalog implementation or collection implementation, I could use that.
Yes, you could. Yes. You'll find it at /API. So vam.ac.uk/API. And we redid the API when we relaunched Explore the Collections. And there is, again, some blog posts about that as well. So absolutely. Have a go. Tell us what you think. For those of us in the community who are interested, it was really important for us to look at the API at the same time, but also, as I say, look at IIIF. So using IIIF, all our imagery is available through IIIF as well. So that's another exciting opportunity that takes one in a different direction around how these images are presented in consistent and accessible ways.
So the digital collections obviously helped museum visitors during a period when museums were closed and we were all in lockdown in various different countries, certainly in the UK. So how do you see museums going forward once museums open up to the public again? How can digital technologies augment the experience of a museum visitor? Do they do that at all?
It's such a big a question that I think I'll unpack in two different directions. One is around this moment of lockdown when it first happened meant that we looked to online delivery in possibly not different ways, but I think certainly internally there was an increased awareness of just how important a role the internet plays in terms of access when the doors are closed. And then the second direction is around how digital technologies are used within the sort of context of the museum itself, within our bricks and mortar offer. So to take the first strand, museums around the globe have been doing such exciting things with digital technologies for the last 30 years and beyond. There's always been an appetite, for example, things like audio guides, which now feel like really old school technology.
They do.
They've been around for decades and decades and decades. That was exciting technology, a way to tell stories to people inside the museum. I think the museum space has often been a brilliant playground for exploring new technologies. And I think the role of the internet in terms of providing access to our collections is such a vital one. That, after all, is sort of core to any museum. Any museum's purpose is to provide universal access to our collections. That's part of why we exist. But I think it's in more recent years that people have thought about that in really creative ways, to think about designing that access as experience in the same way we think about the experience of exhibitions within our buildings. And I think the lockdown, for those institutions that hadn't really understood the value that the web presents and digital technologies presents, I think certainly had a bit of a wake-up call. I think for us at the V&A, it has been understood and accepted that this is an important part of the offer, that most people's contact with the V&A is a virtual one that exists online. Even if you just think about our website, it's about 4 times as many people that connect with us through the website than will walk through the doors. Obviously, the nature of that interaction and that connection is a very different one. But we did feel an increased pressure, I think, because the moment the doors shut, that became the only way to connect with us, through our website, through our social media, through our content sitting on other platforms like YouTube, etc. There was a sort of, the psychology of it was very difficult. I think digital teams across the sector felt a huge amount of pressure to do more, when actually we were already doing lots. We were really keen to point out what already existed, that there was brilliant content already online. That's what put the onus on us to sort of get our explore the collections beta at that bit sooner, because we really saw that where normally exhibitions take the lion's share of our online interaction, it became the collections. What was interesting is the types of content that was performing really well, and it was almost like a spectrum of serious, weighty, important, interesting stuff. For example, like the content we've produced about Leonardo da Vinci's codexes or codices that we hold in our collections, tiny little notebooks written in mirrored back to front handwriting. And people were just really engrossed in that kind of material. And then on the other side of the sort of experience spectrum, people just loving fun, trivial stuff, just stuff to distract them from all the serious, grim stuff happening around them. So we have an interactive called Design a Wig. It's just a fun way for you to create a Marie Antoinette style wig. People just love that. So it was sort of interesting seeing these very different types of behaviors and needs across this experience spectrum of like serious and much more sort of scholarly to trivial and fun and more throwaway. That's what we saw, this sort of increased appetite at that particular time. And what does that mean for the future? It means making more of that content, continuing to prioritize that kind of content that really understands those different types of interaction and need, and how to serve them quite single-mindedly, not try to do something that's scholarly and fun and about making, but really deciding where to place our efforts, I guess, around making the right content for the right audience.
We talked about headsets, and yes, of course, in exhibitions and all of that, they still exist. But technology is moving ahead. Do you see us walking around in 3D headsets doing virtual reality? Is that where you think it's going to head in future?
It depends on what sort of museum you are. The V&A is one that is absolutely about having what we call a heads up experience, looking at this incredible environment around you, looking at all the wonderful objects in what is a mythical, but it does feel true, of 7 miles of galleries. You want to keep your head up and keep looking at these incredible objects and seeing the stories around them. And so the role of digital technologies within the galleries needs to be handled quite deftly and sensitively. So we're not just sticking in a load of headsets and digital tools, etc., that might be more appropriate, for example, in a science museum where people are expecting gadgets and interactive stuff. But that said, we know there's absolutely a role that digital technologies play within the context of the museum. And that's something we're really excited to explore for the new collections centre at V&A East. This is where things like headsets come into play around context, how we create context around those objects. And I think when we're looking at technology, we are always thinking about its affordances. So thinking about what that technology specifically can deliver in terms of human interaction. And so whilst VR is a really exciting and interesting opportunity, it needs to be handled sensitively and appropriately so that we're not just asking people to stick on headsets for the sake of saying we can do a cool VR thing and you're going to love it because it's VR. Instead, for example, we take the story as the starting point and the audience and think about the nature of those interactions and then think about if and how something like VR might help add to that experience. For example, we were approached for our current Alice in Wonderland exhibition called Alice Curiouser and Curiouser by HTC Vive Arts, who are interested in sponsoring the exhibition and asked us whether we would be interested in a VR experience. And the answer to that was, of course, yes, because with the story of Alice in Wonderland, how else can you create a sense of scale? How else
You
can
can
you
literally
create?
fall.
Yes, literally fall down the rabbit hole
Indeed.
and shrink when you drink from the drink me bottle. So VR felt like absolutely the right technology to use to help tell that story. And so we created a VR experience for inside the exhibition. But because that was developed during lockdown, and the exhibition did open when the doors opened back again at the museum. But at that time, we thought before we opened again that this is such brilliant content. We've got an opportunity to think about the at-home audience, the people who won't walk through the doors of the V&A and come to the Alice exhibition. And so we created an extended version that's available on all the major VR platforms that takes you through a 3-chapter experience. So you start tumbling down the rabbit hole and then you essentially play 3 different types of games. And it was so interesting to learn so much about the different types of thinking and designing that one has to do within a 360-degree context and the different types of game mechanics that would suit the storyline and really use those affordances of VR. We have a game of hedgehog croquet that's in the exhibition and the at-home version. But the at-home version, you also
Sounds fun.
it is really fun. It's very hard, but it's fun, and it uses, for example, the sort of hand tracking on the Vive headset. Then we have another game around more of a cerebral game with the caterpillar in the psychedelic field of mushrooms, where you can play a word game with his smoke bubbles and using your gestures to try and find the right answers, and then a hunt for the white rabbit's missing glove. It taught us a lot in terms of how one builds experience to help pull on different sort of story threads of the core Alice in Wonderland story, but sort of retell it in new ways for a virtual audience. We learnt a lot, not least that it's very hard to run the logistics of VR within the context of an exhibition where it's very, very busy. There's sort of bigger questions about experience design, how to bake in the VR as part of a bigger experience that is the exhibition itself.
It sounds like you've got a lot of balls currently juggling in the air of stuff that you do. I mean, how big is your team then?
Across digital media and publishing, it is 28 of us, with about just under 20 of us on digital media. We've had vacancies because, like many museums, it's been tough times for us all financially. So we had a recruitment freeze. So we are really hoping to ramp up sort of pace of our digital design and development program. But I think we are still, in museum terms, fairly small compared to some of the other national museums. But obviously, incredibly large compared to most museums who often have
Mm.
much, much smaller digital teams. So we're very conscious that we've got huge resources at our disposal, brilliant, talented teams. And so that's why we're really keen on sharing our learnings.
There's another aspect that we haven't touched on. Maybe we can do this briefly,
Hmm.
because again, you mentioned 1.2 million or thereabout objects in the museum, but of course they're not all on display. How do you decide what you show? First of all, in the museum, but can we access the content online? Could we potentially browse through the whole catalog of 1.2 million objects online in the archive? And are people actually doing that?
They are indeed. So we have a massive digitization program. When I say the number keeps changing, that's why it's sort of around 1.2. I think it might be 1.3 now, because of course we're also acquiring new
Mm.
objects to our collection as well. Also, we're acquiring different types of objects. Some of those objects are born digital objects, which present all kinds of interesting challenges and opportunities in terms of what
Yeah.
access means for an object that doesn't physically exist. It's much easier to think about how one represents and provides access to an 18th century vase online compared to how one provides access to the game Flappy Bird, for example, which is also in our collections. We have a big digitization program that basically tries to focus on getting as much of our collections online, even if it's in a fairly minimal way. So for some of our collections, you will just find object but data. Some of them you will find image assets too. I think it's around 85% of our collections are available online, and then a percentage of those will have images. So you'll find a range of fidelity in terms of the information available online. For some of the most popular, famous areas of the collection, you'll find a wealth of collections data, for example, around the bed of ware, but also lots of the editorial content. And for other things, you might just have a few minimal pieces of information. It puts an interesting challenge to us as a digital team about how to create an experience that can flex across very
Mm.
minimal representation online and then very fulsome representation online.
It's a fascinating subject. I've got a million more questions, but we're running out of time a little bit. But one thing that comes to mind is an article that I read recently in the Financial Times about the rather binary view that we have of science on the one hand and arts and design on the other, and that they're often contradictory, and then it's an either or. But the V&A actually puts the two together, certainly in the digital effort that you're doing. So, how important do you think that design is then in the technical and digital world that we live in?
It's interesting you pick up on this idea of the sort of art and science being this sometimes artificially separated. You'll find if you walk around the physical building, these motifs built into the fabric of the V&A in South Kensington that are initials A and S, and it's about art and science together. This is absolutely at the underpinnings of the V&A itself, which came out of the Great Exhibition of 1851. And actually, lots of the holdings at what was then the South Kensington Museum, which also had incarnations before that, that is now the V&A, actually had some science holdings, and those have now formed what is now the Science Museum over the road. So even across the Exhibition Road, you have art and science, but within the V&A
Mm.
itself, still a mixture of the two. And I think we're always looking at how our objects tell us about the world around us, both from in terms of our history, but also speak to our future. And I think you can't really tell that story if you're just looking through the lens of art or design or science. You need to think about it in the round. That said, it's interesting to look at objects that are held at both the V&A and at the Science Museum. For example, we both have an object that is the world's first 3D printed gun. And
Okay.
it is interesting to see how the V&A tells that story compared to how the Science Museum tells that story. Now, those are both equally valid stories, but we're coming at it from slightly different institutional perspectives. And
Mm.
that's why it's so exciting to think about how open source technologies and how greater sharing between institutions, again, can help tell these bigger stories with a slightly different lens from each institution, but help people on the web get this sort of greater understanding of the meaning of these objects and why they're so important to tell us stories about
Mm.
contemporary culture and where our culture is ultimately headed.
Well, thank you so much, Kati. That was an exciting interview. I very much enjoyed that. I hope that people will go to the online store as well as hopefully go to the museum,
Absolutely, come to
because it
both.
indeed. And I wish you all the best for the future and for the formidable task that you face with the digitalization process. So that's good luck with all of that.
Thank you so much for having me, Peter. It's been a brilliant conversation.